Ryan Holt, welcome back to Suit Up the Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Terrence. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited. You had posted a really great, well, all your posts are really great on Instagram. People that aren't following, at Analyze This Mr. Bond on Instagram, linked below. But there was a comment that Stephen Knight gave in an interview about how he compared James Bond to being like, it's folklore now. And
Yeah.
you had a really great post about that comment because it's the juxtaposition James Bond sits in. He is a national myth, and he is also a pulp hero in a very real sense, in the same way that Stephen Marlowe or any of the, not Stephen Marlowe, Philip Marlowe. Wow, I'm gonna get my noir card taken from me. Philip Marlowe or any Sam Spade, these classic literary characters that have transcended their form.
Yeah.
James Bond fits in that mold. And I just thought it would be fun to have a conversation about how James Bond sits in that tension and then kind of what that means for other literary characters.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting tension because it's brought about what I might call like a productive schizophrenia in the series
Yes.
a little bit. Uh, because as you rightly pointed out, James Bond is not the only character this has happened to. The pulp hero, I don't have a good academic definition of the hero, but the pulp hero is typically, in my estimation, and you can push back if you disagree on this, a little bit of a tends to be sometimes an unsavory character, or at least a
Hmm.
character cast in shades of gray. Not
Yes.
necessarily, not necessarily villainous, maybe not
Hmm.
even a proper anti-hero, but not necessarily Superman, right?
Hmm.
Not Superman, not Spider-Man, not this character with a pure heart of gold. There is typically at least some level of cynicism that
Hmm.
marks the pulp hero, even figures like the adventure pulp hero flavor, like
Yes.
we see with um, Indiana Jones, for example. Indiana
Hmm.
Jones was originally formed as a more cynical character than he became,
Hmm.
right? This kind of treasure hunter who was not necessarily like the most
He's not
nice
filing
person.
permits to take any of this stuff usually, too.
No, leaves a string of rough relationships in his wake, especially when you start to get into like Temple of Doom and you're seeing him be this more like wanton treasure hunter type that is a little like willing to step over people to do that. That kind of moral complexity for the pulp hero is there. And usually they're the figure that ends up being on the right side
Hmm.
of things in the situation, but they're not necessarily blameless or what we might even call virtuous or noble people. And James Bond is certainly that, right? We
Hmm.
go back to, you could go back to Fleming, but I think Fleming's character is actually a lot softer and nicer than the version audiences saw when Connery appeared in 1962's Doctor No for the first time.
That scene where he takes the towel and walks up to Miss Tarot, I still think that that accurately depicts the range of Connery as an actor and his role as Bond, where he is the
Right.
seducer, but with a very hard edge and a fist ready to fly.
Right. There is a kind of it kind of almost like sadistic element to Connery's Bond that is really mean. He is a mean, nasty character, especially in Doctor No, where I've had arguments about this, and if your opinion is different on mine, where he like shoots Dent in the back just to make him like feel one more bullet as he's dying, right? Like
Hmm.
there's this really kind of savage element
Hmm.
to Connery's presence, and it's appealing and it's charismatic and it's striking. And a lot of the allure there is just that this is a dangerous guy,
Hmm.
right? And a lot of the discourse when that first Bond film came out, like it was condemned by the Vatican for the violence, like this character was not necessarily viewed as a hero. He was viewed as a tough sort of noir character.
Hmm.
And the movie wants you to enjoy being along for the ride. He gets the heroic victory at the end with the girl, but this character is not in any way presented as being in line with what people might consider virtuous social norms. If anything, he's continually pushing at this. This character is a womanizer in an era
Hmm.
where womanizing is not really acceptable. He's kind of brazen about
Well,
that. He
and
is,
we even have
yeah.
in when we get Roger Moore's line, it's in Live and Let Die, the moment where he's like, "But the cards, destined that we would be lovers." Talk about something that does not play as moral, especially in today's day and age. It's like, oh yeah, no, this is not the paragon of virtue here.
No, he's kind of disreputable, and in the Roger Moore era, who you brought us into, that character becomes more of like an impster trickster
Hmm.
archetype a little bit, pushing back against the British establishment. So that brings us to The Spy Who Loved Me, really, which is, I think, the film that kind of crowns Bond as this sort of
Hmm.
like heroic
Hmm.
British national icon. Britain
Hmm.
loves James Bond. I'm American, but like the way Britain and people of the broader British Isles love James Bond is
Hmm.
like it's deep in their blood. They kind of claimed Bond as a national folk hero once he's parachuting off the cliff with the Union Jack.
Hmm.
That's kind of interesting. In the same movie, Bond is also being this disreputable trickster. You get that moment at the end of the film with the Minister of Defense like looking on with Bond, and he's like, what you gonna do? I'm James Bond. And then you get the male chorus singing that very camp version of Nobody Does It Better. Da 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 da. Um, that whole kind of ethos becomes part of the character at that point. I think up to
Hmm.
that point, even in the
Hmm.
first two Roger Moore movies, you have Bond being kind of this disreputable figure. Roger
Hmm.
Moore's Bond in those first two installments is a jerk to everybody in
Yes.
those movies. And by that time, suddenly you're like, oh no, Bond is now a national icon for the
Hmm.
world, a global hero on the side of the angels, so to speak. And the series adopts that in a big way, and it suits Roger Moore well because Roger
Yes.
Moore's personality is kind of, I love Roger Moore's Bond, but he's not really playing a human being. He's playing an idea of a human
Yes.
being. And the series embraces that. And it
Hmm.
never is really quite able to leave that behind. It tries to like
Hmm.
pivot away from that when you get Dalton's Bond. And Dalton's Bond is again a very human, like
Hmm.
more subdued version of it. But you're back at GoldenEye, and Pierce
Hmm.
Brosnan is now the representative of this kind of decades past legacy coming into the Cold War, and Bond, the icon, needs to
Hmm.
transcend the fall of
Hmm.
Russia and enter into the landscape. And the
Hmm.
Brosnan films tend to be very celebratory about it. And even the Craig movies, especially when you get into Skyfall and
Oh,
he's the
yes.
British bulldog, it's it's celebrating this character, even though they're kind of continually dancing around, well, this character's also a murderer, and he's also kind
Hmm.
of like not the nicest person, but he's also so heroic, and then he gets like a hero send-off in No Time to Die with
Hmm.
Hans Zimmer anthemic themes, tears streaming down people's faces as he gets blown into oblivion, standing on the mountainside like Moses looking out on the promised land that he'll never see, the fire consuming him from the side. You get this big, like, oh,
Hmm.
this character has entered the realm of true heroic myth at
Hmm.
this in time. And that's kind of the arc of the series as we've seen it. And so it's been really interesting to see the series kind of try to live in both of those worlds
Hmm.
simultaneously, where they can simultaneously have a character have the conversation in the movie where it's like, you're really kind of like a dark character, and then in the next scene, the character would be like, "You're a good man, James," and it's like, which what's the angle? And honestly, it's both of those things because the audience
Hmm.
wants to feel both ways simultaneously. They want to live in the cognitive dissonance of this hero being both a bad guy who would do things that they would
Hmm.
never do, and also this character being their own personal hero who's going to save the world, and they can live vicariously through them in that.
I love they brought up No Time to Die because in that film, I think they do so many. I mean, it's the Hercules project. It's the poison blood. There's so many mythic allusions to Bond as a character being tied to literally the larger than life Hercules, which again, I think is a great comparison here because He is, for the Greeks of especially the Mediterranean, that era, he is their Superman. He is their everything. Every king is like, oh, I'm a descendant of Hercules or a descendant of Zeus, neither of which are great people. And they're horrible, horrible characters. But because of the mighty deeds that they did, they transcended mortality and became heroes. And
Mm.
James Bond exists in that same juxtaposition. As you know, when writing characters, you want to have that level of complexity where there are contradictions to their characters. And I think what's fascinating is seeing how much Bond's character. There are contradictions in Fleming where you have that the spy who loved me, he's very tender, very kind, but at the end of the day, he's a bad man. Now that's delivered to us very ham-fistedly, literally at the end of the story in dialogue, but that's still something that just draws out further when we as the audience want him to be more of this or that. And I just find that utterly fascinating.
I think what you just said is very insightful because I have always felt that No Time to Die was like very rooted in this sort of like Greek tragedy ethos and also a Greek hero ethos. Because
Hmm.
like the Greek, we call the Greek tragedies and the Greek heroic narratives separate things, but they're really the same things. Like
Yes.
if you follow a heroic narrative long enough, there's tragedy. You follow Jason and the Argonauts, you have the Medea
Yes.
chapter afterwards.
And he dies by the Argo's prow falling on his head. Like this is his like epic life is that the ship that made him famous kills him.
Right. And I think we can have quibbles about how the movie handled it, but I was born and raised on the Greek myths and all of their
Hmm.
authority complexity. I was fine with treating Bond in that way because I think there is some nice parallel to the way the
Hmm.
Greeks viewed their heroes, as you've rightly pointed out. For the Greek mind, it was a pre-Christian society, so goodness
Hmm.
and greatness were not um, linked together in any capacity. It wasn't about like sainthood when
Hmm.
you like ascended into heroism. Even their gods they tended to regard as kind of like bad people at times. You read the Iliad and Zeus comes
Hmm.
off really bad in the Iliad, but they'll still be like, you gotta revere the gods, man. They're powerful. It was more of this admiration
Hmm.
of strength and accomplishment. So like
Hmm.
this James Bond character who could be very uh morally questionable, but is also just like the guy who by through virtue of strength is going to overcome these
Hmm.
sinister forces is worthy of celebration. That is a very kind of Greek approach to a hero. And
Hmm.
giving him this kind of really kind of bitter Greek send-off, I
Hmm.
think it made sense with that sense of the Daniel Craig era of this character being like inherently heroic and tragic at the same time, which was a consistent through line.
Yes.
I think where it was really rough for a lot of folks is that this came after Skyfall had already like recanonized
Yes.
Bond as the icon of like modern heroism and
Hmm.
British identity. And so it comes back to this exact sort of like schizophrenia where it's one thing to kill a man who happens to be called James Bond, who is a hero. It's another thing to kill
A British
James
icon.
Bond, the spirit of modern Britain. Um, and that's kind of tough a little bit.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it just gives such it's rightly, wrongly. Bond is an is the vestige of British imperial colonialism. That was Fleming created a character who could be still the identity of what Great Britain was pre-war in a lot of
Yeah,
senses. Down to the fact that if you really look at it, Bond as a character identifies more as the gentleman spy of the late third, well, I'll say it's like the 30s, pre-World War II. The last vestige of the gentleman spy is in World War II. But really it's something that came out of World War One and into that era. And so when we kill off Bond very dramatically, cinematically, we are looking at a parallel of what the rise and decline of the British Empire and its current status in the world, unfortunately. But I think to that point, that's where it's interesting to see where it sits in the just historical landscape. A lot of our legends and our myths are still very, uh, for lack of a better term, British centric. Like when we think of Robin Hood and King Arthur, these literal icons of what we consider to be the greatest of myths, they're British institutions that have
Yeah.
been exported and just popularized. Most people do not know the Song of Roland, which is like, if I recall correctly, like the either Italian or French like hero archetype that would have been competitive with King Arthur. But guess what? King Arthur's a better story.
They had a lot of turns it back to refine the King Arthur story too. But yes, it is the better story. And I think again, it's notable too that King Arthur and Robin Hood both have like these bittersweet,
Yes.
heroic endings that kind of encapsulate their arcs. They are both in their own way complicated characters. King Arthur in the
Hmm.
proper myth has the whole Guinevere, Lancelot like saga.
Hmm.
And
And he's born of bastardy in the original
yes,
myth, which is
right.
not where your like actual good heroes are supposed to come from in most classic literature.
No, 100%. So in many ways, this heroic tradition we're talking about isn't just Greek. It kind of carried on into the broader like post Greek like Christian
Hmm.
assimilation project as like mythologies kind of grafted into Christendom. Um, this kind of ethos survived. I think Robin Hood is particularly a good example here because he's
Yes.
kind of like the bandit
Hmm.
trickster hero who um who is kind of like a pretty decent analog for
Hmm.
a kind of uh outside the fringes of respectable society hero. King Arthur is complex in his own way, but he is also King Arthur. He's like
He's
the
still the institution.
he's the institution, right? Robin Hood is kind of on the fringes of it, and he
Hmm.
obviously has his support of restoring like the institution in a way, but he's not that properly. But yeah, he still has that like bitter ending with the arrow. One of my favorite takes on Robin Hood, well, we can just talk about this, is the one where Sean Connery appeared as Robin Hood in
I
Robin
still
and
haven't
Marian.
seen it. It's on my list to watch this year because it looks just, I mean, Connery.
It is a savage movie. I love that movie to death. It is the there was this awful trend, and it still continues to this day, of like, let's take a hero and let's do
Yes.
like a postmodern take where everything is like really depressing and everything just like erodes who this character is. And Robin and Marion with Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn does that, but does it in the most like literary and poetic,
Mm.
beautiful way possible. And
Hmm.
it's a really deep, thoughtful reckoning with, oh, what does it look like when an old version of this character is existing in a world that doesn't make sense to him and
Hmm.
his heroism didn't pay off. It's kind of like the darkest timeline version of like what happened to like all the Star Wars characters that we talk about, but like actually
Hmm.
like committed to it in a way that doesn't feel like they were just scrambling notes on a napkin and that's how everything turned out. Beautiful movie, but we're we're I'm freewheeling here a little bit away from the Bond character himself, and I think what is really interesting about hearing Stephen Knight bring up these exact
Hmm.
myths, talking about King
Yes.
Arthur and Robin Hood as part of his guiding vision for Bond 26 tells me that he is thinking thoughtfully about
Hmm.
how this has become part of this character's
Hmm.
legacy. We have also heard simultaneously that he's going back to the Ian Fleming novels to just like parse out Ian Fleming's dialogue even and see if he can lift
Hmm.
out some of the great dialogue from those novels, which is interesting. So he's clearly engaged with the history of this character, and we know Stephen Knight from like Peaky Blinders is no stranger to
Hmm.
being dark men of moral complexity, right? Let's
Hmm.
put it that way. Um, so I'm really intrigued to see what that will mean because it sounds like Stephen Knight really wants this character in his incarnation of it to represent something about
Hmm.
Britain now, I would assume. And we don't know anything about this movie. We don't know whether it's going to be a period piece, what their exact approach is for Bond 26, but it seems like Stephen Knight is very much thinking about, okay, we're going to take Bond, this symbol of heroic Britain and play with
Hmm.
it. I'm excited to
Hmm.
see somebody who is kind of divorced from the Eon franchise
Hmm.
try to process that
Yeah.
in a way that is different. I would say my enthusiasm for what Bond 26 was going to be like shot through the roof when I saw Stephen Knight was going to do it. And these
Yes.
comments um, definitely made me think that there could be potentially something really conceptually interesting going on here. How do you feel about Stephen Knight leaning in that direction?
When people ask me my Bond 26 opinions, usually their immediate thing is, well, about Villeneuve, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the director is extremely important, but biased as a writer, I'm the nerd that always looks for who's the writing credit. And
Yeah.
that's the thing that inspires me with the most hope and excitement for this film is that Stephen Knight is the one that's doing the writing. Because I think that, because correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember right, he's a producer on the film too, correct?
I don't know if he is. I would
Okay.
have to double check
I
that.
I
But
can't remember, but
I
point
wouldn't be
being,
surprised. I wouldn't be surprised because you would think of all the people on this creative team that they
yeah.
want like the long-term investment in, it's going to be Stephen Knight in some capacity.
I think that that gives me the most confidence in this film just because he's a competent writer who understands the material and the substance. I think what's also interesting to point out is I don't remember exactly like how old he is, but we have experienced Bond as the post essentially post GoldenEye era.
Yeah.
That has been the primary, like, we understand Bond in that sense and context. Whereas Stephen Knight is old enough, he remembers Bond as being something that wasn't cast as a national icon yet. And that's something I think is interesting to see as there is a generation that has experienced Bond going from this, oh, there were books, there are a couple of movies. Now he is launched into the stratosphere. The Bond mania has happened. And I'm excited to see how that affects the way that he views writing it. Because clearly he understands what the collective consciousness of Bond is. And I think that he understands
Yeah.
British history enough too to want to integrate. I mean, he did the SAS Heroes type show. Like,
Yeah.
I think he understands who the character of Bond is based on. So I'm
Yes.
excited to see how that plays through his conception of a Bond story.
I'm really excited to see it as well too. I think there is one thing that's really great about Stephen Knight is that he's really focused on dialogue as a writer.
Yes.
And one of my great complaints about the Bond series that's pretty long-standing is that I think it got away from dialogue very early on. Like dialogue uh, was a real focal point in
Hmm.
Fleming. Bond is a very talky character in the books that is
Hmm.
kind of like shockingly different than some of his screen presentation, where Bond will like essentially monologue in the books at great length. And then you get into the movies and they develop this more humorous sort of banter style with Connery. The
Hmm.
dialogue of those first three movies is really sharp and really
Hmm.
clever. And then by Thunderball, it starts to turn into the quit machine a little bit.
Which you get
Still
to my
good,
teeth.
still good banter, still clever, still really witty. But then you kind of like lose that a little bit.
Hmm.
And I was really worried with Denis Villeneuve being suggested as director for this because
Very
he's
visual, very visual, but word he makes the Dune movies. They're not, you don't watch them for the dialogue.
no, he's honestly said that he prefers to think in terms of images and treat his movies like silent films. And so, oh, I was like, oh, this is going to be really austere. But when you pair him with Stephen Knight, you have this
Hmm.
kind of interesting creative tension. It's a little bit like when David Fincher did an Aaron Sorkin script for The Social
Yes.
Network, where it's
Yes.
like potentially this really interesting synergy could happen between this distinct directorial style and a writer who is a little bit more engaged with genre and the rhythms of what I might call classic Bond. Certain scenes in SAS Rogue Heroes just feel like excerpts from a Brosnan Bond movie. So it's
Yeah.
not that he's not going to play with those textures. He said he's having a ball. I'm sure he is having a ball writing it.
It's got to be like one of the greatest writing gigs you can get. Both terrifying and you get to play with the toy.
You do, and I really will be interested to see if he remains like the single sole writer on it, because
Hmm
usually the way the Eon Productions Bond
hmm
movies have happened is you kind of get a carousel of writers no matter what. Like it was always a carousel of
hmm
writers. I'll be interested to see whether Stephen Knight's authorial voice is really
hmm
preserved in this. But at any rate, we know he's engaged with this idea of what Bond represents as a figure today, which I think was unavoidable after Bond got exploded at the end of No Time to Die. Um, as this in this symbolic thing, you were going to always have to come back to the table and be like, okay, well, what is Bond meaning
hmm
now? And I think what'll be interesting to see is hopefully they don't do it quite in the GoldenEye and Skyfall way, which was like
Yeah.
Bond is out of context. How do we then like reestablish him in a way that
hmm
validates him in this new context? That was kind of the like the times had changed Bond
hmm
kind of model, and do it more so in a way that's a little bit more ground up, that's a little bit more, well, we're at a new starting point. How does
hmm
Bond make sense in whatever
hmm
landscape they're situating him in? I'm really intrigued to see what comes of that.
hmm It
And
actually reminds me a little of when they created Sherlock as a show. Part of, I think it was Stephen Moffat, was
yeah,
like the thing that he realized to put in a modern context is you can still have a soldier come home from Afghanistan and be thrown into these events. And I hope that they do something similar. Not exactly, because I know that they tried doing that with what's it called? Is it Carte Blanche? Where it's, oh, this is Bond, modern context, modern backstory, complete like rewrite. I think First Light is probably going to do take that and soft launch a concept that I
yeah.
hope to see as a through line because you can still have a similar-ish sense of background and history that then carries into. But I also don't want an origin story. I just want let's get Bond on the page and on the screen.
I think
Do
Bond
you
is
want an
very
origin story? Actually, very good
no,
question. Okay, okay.
no, 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 no. I'm fine with it in 007 First Light because they're having a lot of fun with it, and I think it's a nice tonal reversal of the Daniel Craig era, where it's like instead
hmm
of this like really depressed, hardened guy finding some sense of purpose, it's like there's this young, charming kid who is like
hmm
learning to be a killer through like experience. It's kind of like a nice inverse of that uh,
hmm
arc that still gets him to the same place at the end. It's still like we're gonna Bond is going to find his place by the end, but it's like a hyper charming,
hmm
fun-loving playboy type that then gets
hmm
dark and as opposed to like the reverse. I'm fine with that, but I don't need to see it play out and again. And I'm really tired of having to watch stories about like Bond learn to be Bond. That was pretty much
Yes. The
that
entire arc of the Daniel Craig movies.
it was, and even in No Time to Die, it's like you're not Bond anymore. You gotta relearn to be Bond. It's the and which Skyfall had done two
hmm
movies prior. Like it's I I I'm really happy to have this character just arrive on the scene.
hmm
I think a way to split the difference is I said this too. They could do something like they did with the recent Robert Pattinson The Batman, where
Yes.
he's fully established.
hmm
He's got the gear. He's got the Batmobile. We don't need to see him
hmm
learn how to do this stuff again, but he's also not so seasoned that he can't learn things, that the dynamics
hmm
aren't like set in stone. He hasn't been operating for 10 years and has like a veteran's round of experience around him. I think that's a kind of nice way to split the difference a little bit, and you can kind of nod in the direction of this character being somebody who's going to continue to mature in some ways, but is also
hmm
who he is. That's what I ideally would want from this. But I do love what you pointed out, which is like this idea of like I hope there's it's set in present day, and I hope
hmm
it is a thoughtful rethink of what this character is in this context. Because I think one of the exciting things about the Bond character is the way he
hmm
develops over time. And it's not to say that I want a movie that is steeped in the politics of today. I think that's actually something that has gotten the movies in trouble. Like
Yes.
the really dumb treatment of like, is Bond better than an assassin drone conversation in Spectre is like that's like an ethical question we don't need to ask in a pulp story. It's like I don't really need to ask if
Is
like
this Tom Clancy?
maybe
I don't
you
need a
know
Tom Clancy novel as my Bond.
no. I think that's like a genre mismatch to ask that in the same way. But I think there is um a lot to be done with modern Britain on the scene. I don't think I'm offending anybody by saying that like with the state of Britain, it's a little bit more of like an underdog
Hmm.
posture on the
Hmm.
international scene that I think is exciting. Underdogs make for better
Yes.
story, right?
Hmm.
So so that kind of thing and understanding him as a model of what like a complex British identity could look like today is really interesting. We'll see how Stephen Knight approaches that problem and then how Denis decides to render it. But I'm feeling pretty optimistic that at the very least we're going to get something pretty interesting
Hmm.
out of Bond 26. Fingers crossed. Um,
Times of change are either moments for great opportunity, are always moments for great opportunity, regardless of how it turns out. And I will say this, regardless of the outcome of the film itself, Bond 26, I look forward to like the 10, 15, 20 years down the line when we get all of the back room information on, oh, these were the multiple different like drafts in consideration and the conversations, because those lost stories of Bond that like I think it's Mark Edlitz
yeah.
uh compile are just fascinating and so much fun. The movies that almost were, it's the fantasy that you can enjoy of what would that third Dalton film have looked like and things of that ilk. So I'm excited.
I can't wait for that. I love thinking about phantom movies of the past. I love reading unproduced screenplays and dreaming of what might come to fruition from that. Hopefully the movie when it comes out, it doesn't leave us wanting so much that everything that was phantom
Yes.
seems more exciting than what we got. But I think it seems like every signal has been everybody involved
Hmm.
wants to make something um hugely cool
Hmm.
and thoughtful and interesting. And you can't really ask for more given
No.
the circumstances of it.
Well, and as
And
you've pointed out, it's a really great sign they didn't rush something into production after getting the rights. And that I think gives me more hope, more pause, because as much as I know we want a new Bond film, I would much rather have a time is taken to make an amazing movie than rushing some very poorly constructed piece of garbage onto the page and onto the stage.
yes, I mean, when the announcement happened, my first thought is like, oh, okay, they're gonna announce Henry Cavill as Bond in 6 months after they've got the like the ink is dry, and that movie is gonna be rushed into production with a release date of November 2026. And admittedly, there were many fans that wanted that path to happen, I'm sorry for them that it didn't because I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, but I do think that the worry would be that if something had been rushed into production, there would not have been
Hmm.
sufficient thought around it. Not that I think Bond is rocket science to make, but
Hmm.
but I think there is a sense that you get this feeling that Amazon at least understood the gravity of the assignment, which is like
Hmm.
can't you can't just uh you can't just take on this machinery without having really thoughtfully built a team that's ready to
Hmm.
carry it forward. Um, so I we will see. But I really hope that whatever they do, um, they have put some thought into not just what they want this movie to be, but what they want the character to be overall as it goes forward. Not in
Hmm.
a rigid way. Some people have pointed out that like I don't know how you feel about like continuity and archetypes, but I think like they shouldn't back themselves into a corner by setting
Hmm.
up some sort of mega story arc that
No.
they
Oh, no,
they
no, no, no.
they can't pay off. But I do hope that they have some at least a vision for like
Hmm.
what it would look like to get from like one to film one, two, and three, and then like
Yes.
kind of evolve from there. It doesn't have to be story. It just has to
Hmm.
be like this is
Hmm.
what this take of Bond should be for the next uh 10 years, I would say is a reasonable expectation so that they have kind of some sort of Bible to go
Hmm.
by.
Well, that's what they did perfectly, I think, in the original Connery movies. That
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder like what the original conversation was with Casino Royale to then Quantum, because it felt like they were trying to do a long-term setup at Casino that then they just rushed into in Quantum for the payoff. That
That
in the Connery movies, you have multiple films building up the idea of Spectre and just weaving it in a little bit in the background without it having to be the main thing. You don't even have to have like this huge deal about it. You just need to layer in a little flourish and a little touch here and there. And I think those movies, to your point on dialogue, they masterfully wrote the screenplays. Richard Maybaum did a great job of we're creating a series, but without each
yeah.
one can be watched individually without feeling like you have to have the continuity.
Yeah, very much so. And they also took like a nice little like detour from it. It wasn't the sense of
Hmm.
like they
We
were
have to build to this.
you have to build to this, which is refreshing. I Quantum of Solace is an interesting case.
I
There
know.
was very clearly the Some Kind of Hero book by AJ Chowdhury is
I still need to read it.
fabulous
Okay.
in covering Quantum of Solace in particular, because Purvis and Wade give you the scoop on what their early drafts of it were. And so that movie was written as Casino Royale was wrapped up. Like there was always this
Hmm.
intention that he's going to capture Mr. White at the end of Casino Royale. We're going to have like
Hmm.
a car chase at the start of the next movie that picks up with this story, and Bond is going to continue to investigate the organization. It seemed like it was originally a two-parter, but they kind of were thinking like probably trilogy
Hmm.
arc. And then the writer's strike happened with Quantum of Solace.
Yeah.
I think everybody involved felt unhappy enough with what got across the plate that they really backed out of the trilogy plan at the last second, like even to the extent of cutting what was the cliffhanger ending of Quantum of Solace, setting
Mm.
up a third a third parter. Uh,
Okay.
so unfortunate because I actually think the original version of Quantum of Solace sounds pretty great. It's all the same pieces, just in a
Hmm.
different order.
Which
Uh,
I've argued, I really like Quantum visually, and even if I'm going with the exact story beats, just the actual finished screenplay itself and the editing, makes me feel a little sick. I still love it. I still have a great deal of fondness. It's my first Craig movie, which I will say very odd to watch that film before seeing Casino Royale, but
Was it
um,
even comprehensible to you? Because I just rewatched it at the gather-all we had here to see it, and the one thing Kyle Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches on Instagram turned to me and he said like would this movie have even been like comprehensible if Casino Royale didn't exist? And I really think that's an honest question. How did you perceive it seeing it without?
I know who knew who James Bond was, and it does do enough to like this at the beginning of the film. It tells you Vesper is dead. That's the reason why. Ironically enough, the that was my second James Bond film. The first one I saw was all Diamonds Are Forever, which also starts with Bond on a revenge mission that
It does.
immediately ends. So I have no idea why he wanted Blofeld. I just knew he wanted Blofeld. So apparently I have like this weirdly, I'm just seeing all the synergy between these two movies, and I never even realized it.
Well, I when they were when Casino Royale had just released, I had actually said, I hope Quantum of Solace is like they took the opening of Diamonds Are Forever and it's just like a whole movie. It's just
Hmm.
Bond like cutting his way through the pipeline. And they didn't quite deliver on my hope for what that was. I didn't get like Bond at some like Cairo casino dive throwing people like across tables and things. Like I really wanted a lot more of that like fun revenge aspect. But I have complicated thoughts about that movie, but I think that is also why you see them kind of backpedal from their version
Hmm.
of Daniel Craig being this kind of like very dark character right off the bat.
Hmm.
So, you know,
Sorry.
oh, you go ahead.
I just had to quickly reply to message for work. That's actually probably a great cue for me to start wrapping up this conversation because otherwise, you and I can talk about Bond and writing and cinematic things, I think, endlessly.
Sure.
Ryan, where can people go to learn more about you and your work? And what can you tell us about your forthcoming novel that you've teased
Oh,
on
yeah.
Instagram? And I am endlessly excited for.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, you can find me primarily on Instagram. Instagram is my biggest home these days. Analyze this, Mr. Bond, on Instagram. But I also write for Substack. You can get to the link
Hmm.
to my Substack, the Vagabond Dossier,
Absolutely.
my profile, and I also do the occasional YouTube video. Also, YouTube Analyze This, Mr. Bond. Um, so find me there. Say hi. Send me a message on Instagram. Happy to talk to everybody. So you asked about the novel. I have a novel that I have been working on for ages and finally going to be releasing it early next year, early 2027. It's called Tomorrow Comes the Bullet.
Nice.
It is a uh, let's say slightly more science fiction minded version of
Hmm.
a James Bond novel. If you are familiar with this science fiction writer Neil Stephenson, who has written a lot of things, it's kind of like an Ian Fleming novel meets Neil Stephenson. So it's very much about a spy confronting the technological
Mm.
changes of the current landscape, hopefully in a smarter way than Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. But we'll get there. Well, I'll let the audience be the judge when the book finally releases. But it has been a passion project of mine. It's a very strange book, but I hope folks get a kick out of it.
I'm excited. You've teased it a little bit. You've shared a snippet with me, and it looks amazing. We'll obviously keep the audience updated, and you'll definitely come on the show to talk about it, I hope.
Of course, it would be my greatest honor.
Ryan, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me, Terrence.